cold mist clings to the hills of northern Britain. Somewhere below, hidden in the gray, 5,000 pairs of boots move in step over wet stone and heather. The sound swallowed almost as soon as it's made. Armor creaks, breath fogs in the air, standards sway above the column, catching what little light finds its way through the cloud. The eagle of Rome, carried by men who have marched this same disciplined rhythm across 3 continents. This is Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Legion. And somewhere in the years that follow this march, they disappear. Not retreat, not surrender. Disappear. No survivors stumbling back with a story to tell. No burned camp for later soldiers to find. No single ancient historian recording their final battle. Just silence and a name that quietly stops appearing in the record. For over a century, this has been one of the most seductive stories in Roman history. A legion of trained soldiers, swallowed whole by the British wilderness. It's a story so compelling that it stopped being history and became myth, retold by Rosemary Sutcliff in her 1954 novel, The Eagle of the Ninth, then carried to the screen decades later. Somewhere along the way, a genuine historical puzzle calcified into something else. A legend everyone assumes they already know. But here's the question this film is going to sit with, uncomfortably, for the next half hour. What if that story isn't what actually happened? What if the 9th didn't vanish in one dramatic massacre at all, and the truth is stranger, messier, and in some ways more unsettling than a clean tragedy in the Highlands? Because it would mean one of Rome's most experienced fighting forces could disappear from history almost by accident, with no one important enough left to notice or care to record it. To answer that, we can't start with the disappearance. We have to start with who the 9th actually were, because the popular version of this story only works if the 9th were ordinary, replaceable, a unit history simply forgot. Yet long before they ever set foot in Britain, this was a legion already tempered by civil war, foreign conquest, and open rebellion. Survivors, not novices. And that history of survival is exactly what makes their disappearance so hard to explain. If the 9th vanished, it wasn't because they were untested. By the time they set foot on British shores, this legion had already spent decades proving itself in some of Rome's hardest campaigns. And that record is the first real obstacle to the massacre myth. An inexperienced unit might be excused for breaking apart quietly. A legion like this one was not supposed to. Their story begins generations earlier, in the chaos of Rome's civil wars. A unit bearing the 9th's name fought under Julius Caesar himself, marching through the mud of Gaul and standing in the ranks at Pharsalus, where Caesar crushed Pompey's army and reshaped the Republic's future. When Caesar was murdered and Rome tore itself apart again, the 9th fought on, reformed under the young Octavian to put down Sextus Pompey's rebellion in Sicily, then thrown into the pivotal Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where Octavian and Mark Antony hunted down Caesar's assassins and ended the civil war for good. For its performance there, the legion earned a nickname of its own, Macedonia. But the name that would follow them into legend came later, forged not in Italy, but in Spain. Between 27 and 19 BC, the 9th fought through the brutal Cantabrian Wars, the campaign that finally dragged the last resistant tribes of the Iberian Peninsula under Roman control. It was mountain warfare at its most punishing. Ambushes in narrow passes, prolonged sieges, an enemy that refused to fight the way Rome wanted it to. The 9th endured all of it, and their conduct there was distinguished enough to rename them a second time. Macedonia became Hispana, Spanish, a title earned in blood, and the one history would remember them by. By the time this legion crossed the channel into Britain then, it was carrying nearly 70 years of hard-won reputation on its shoulders. Veterans of civil war, veterans of foreign conquest, a unit that had already outlasted enemies far more experienced than any it would meet on a cold northern frontier. Which makes it worth asking again, more pointedly this time, if a legion this season really did march into oblivion, why does no one seem to have written it down? The Ninth landed in Britain in AD 43, one of 4 legions Emperor Claudius sent to conquer a province the Romans knew almost nothing about. A cold, waterlogged island at the edge of the known world, defended by tribes who fought nothing like the armies of Gaul or Spain. If this legion's reputation was going to be tested anywhere, it would be here. And it was tested almost immediately, in a battle that should have ended the Ninth story 17 years before the mystery even begins. By AD 60, Rome's grip on southern Britain looked secure enough that most of the province's garrison had marched west to crush a rebellion in Wales. That was the moment the Iceni queen Boudicca chose to rise. Her forces tore through Camulodunum, modern Colchester, burning the Roman colony to the ground. Word reached the acting commander of the Ninth, Quintus Petilius Cerialis, and he did what a Roman officer was trained to do. He marched to relieve the city, without waiting to know the true size of the force he was marching into. He found out too late. Boudicca's army fell on the approaching column and tore the infantry apart. Later accounts suggest as many as 2,000 men, the better part of the legion's fighting strength, died in that single engagement. Cerialis himself survived only by fleeing with his cavalry, leaving the wreckage of his infantry behind him. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. And yet, the Ninth did not cease to exist. It was rebuilt, reinforced, and marched on. 2 decades later, campaigning deep in the Scottish Highlands under the governor Agricola, the legion came close to disaster a second time. Camped for the night near the River Forth, separated from the rest of the Roman column, the Ninth was struck in the dark by a Caledonian warband that breached the camp's defenses and fought its way inside. For a few desperate hours, the outcome hung on a knife's edge. Roman soldiers fighting hand to hand inside their own fortifications, with no guarantee help would arrive in time. It did. Agricola's cavalry reached them before dawn, scattering the attackers and pulling the legion back from the brink. Twice then, the Ninth had stood at the edge of annihilation on British soil, and twice it has survived, bruised but intact, absorbed new recruits, and marched on to fight another campaign. That survival record matters enormously to the mystery ahead, because it means whatever eventually did end the Ninth Legion, it wasn't simply that Britain was a dangerous place to serve. This legion had already proven, more than once, that it could take a devastating blow here and still come back. By the early 2nd century, the Ninth had settled into Eboracum, the fortress that would one day become the city of York, serving as one of the anchors of Rome's northern frontier. And it's here, in the stonework of that fortress, that we find the last piece of solid ground in this entire story. In the Yorkshire Museum today sits a weathered slab of stone, carved with a dedication to the Emperor Trajan. It commemorates the rebuilding of a fortress gateway, and it names, plainly, the unit responsible for the work, the 9th Legion Hispana. The inscription is dated with unusual precision to around AD 108. This is not a theory, not a reconstruction, not a later chronicler's guess. It is the legion's own hand, carved in stone, stating clearly, "We are here, and we are still building." And then nothing. No further inscription bears their name. No tombstone in Britain mentions a soldier of the Ninth after this point. No historian records another campaign, another battle, another posting. For an army as obsessed with record keeping as Rome's, an institution that carved its unit names into bricks, altars, gateposts, and gravestones almost compulsively, this silence is deeply strange. We know that by AD 122, a different legion, the 6th Victrix, had taken over at York. We know that when Hadrian's Wall went up that same year, built by 3 legions working in close cooperation, the Ninth's name appears on none of the construction inscriptions. And when a later list of active Roman legions was carved in Rome around AD 168, the Ninth is simply absent from it, as though it had never existed at all. Somewhere in that gap, between a gateway dedication in AD 108 and a legion list that no longer includes them decades later, the story most people think they know was born. A 19th century historian named Theodore Mommsen looked at this same gap and proposed an answer: that the Ninth had been wiped out by a British uprising around AD 117, its fortress overrun, its survivors scattered or killed. It was a reasonable guess for the evidence available at the time. It is also, as we're about to see, almost certainly wrong, because the story it tells doesn't survive contact with everything archaeologists have found since.
Picture Theodore Mommsen in his study in the 1850s, surrounded by the fragments of evidence available to a historian of his era, a handful of inscriptions, a gap in the record, and a province, Britain, with a well-earned reputation for swallowing Roman ambitions. He looked at the silence that followed AD 108 and reached for the most obvious explanation. The Brigantes, a powerful tribal confederation in northern Britain, had risen up around AD 117, overrun the Ninth in its own fortress, and wiped it from history in a single catastrophic defeat. It's easy to see why this theory took hold. It's dramatic, it's tidy, and it fits the shape of a story people already wanted to tell. Proud Rome, humbled by barbarian resistance at the edge of the world. Nearly a century later, when Rosemary Sutcliff sat down to write a novel for young readers, this was the version of events she inherited and immortalized. The massacre in the north became, in the popular imagination, simply what happened to the Ninth Legion. But theories built on absence have a way of collapsing when new evidence arrives, and this one has collapsed almost entirely. Start with the timeline itself. Mommsen was writing before the AD 108 gateway inscription had been properly dated and understood. That inscription proves the Ninth was alive, active, and building in York a full decade after the uprising Mommsen blamed for their destruction. A legion cannot be wiped out in AD 117 if it's still standing intact in AD 108. The dates simply don't align with a single early rebellion. Then there's the physical evidence, or rather the lack of it. If an entire legion, 5,000 men, had been slaughtered at their own fortress, archaeologists would expect to find some trace: a mass grave, a burned destruction layer, weapons and armors scattered in the ruins of a camp overrun. None of that has ever turned up at York. No battlefield has been identified anywhere in northern Britain that matches a defeat on this scale. For a disaster large enough to erase an entire legion, the ground itself has stayed remarkably, suspiciously quiet. None of this means Britain was peaceful in those years. Quite the opposite, as we'll see. But it does mean the specific story most people know, the one with the burning fortress and the last stand in the mist, isn't what the evidence supports. The myth needed a villain and a battlefield. The record refuses to provide either. So if the Ninth wasn't wiped out at York, the question doesn't go away, it just changes shape. If they didn't die here, where did they go? In 1959, far from the hills of northern Britain, archaeologists working at Nijmegen in the Netherlands uncovered something unexpected: fragments of roof tiles stamped with the mark of the Ninth Legion. Nijmegen sat on the Roman frontier along the Rhine, a legionary base for units guarding the empire's border with unconquered Germania. If the Ninth had left tiles here bearing its own name, that suggested something the massacre theory never allowed for: that this legion hadn't died in Britain at all. It had been transferred. It's not as strange as it might sound. Roman legions were moved across the empire constantly, redeployed wherever the frontier needed reinforcing, and a unit stamping its name into the roofing tiles of a new base was standard practice, not evidence of anything unusual on its own. For a time, this discovery offered something the Mommsen theory never could: a plausible, undramatic explanation. Not a slaughtered legion, but a relocated one, reassigned from a quiet British frontier to a more urgent one along the Rhine, doing exactly what legions were built to do. Further digging at the site added to the picture. Alongside the tiles, archaeologists recovered a bronze pendant bearing an inscription referencing the Ninth, seemingly reinforcing the idea that soldiers of the Legion had genuinely served and perhaps lived at Nijmegen. For a while, this looked like the answer the whole mystery had been building toward: not a story of destruction, but simply one of reassignment, quietly lost to time because nothing dramatic ever happened to record. But the deeper historians looked at this evidence, the less settled it became. The central problem is dating. Roofing tiles are notoriously difficult to date with precision. A tile stamped with a legion's mark could have been made and used years, even decades, after that legion first arrived at a base, and stamps were sometimes reused or left in place long after the unit that made them had moved on again. Some scholars date the Nijmegen material confidently to the early 2nd century, fitting neatly after the York inscription. Others argue the evidence could belong to a slightly earlier period, before the Ninth's confirmed presence in Britain had even ended, which would undercut the relocation theory entirely. There's also a deeper silence to reckon with. If the Ninth truly served at Nijmegen for any meaningful length of time, we might expect more than a handful of fragments, inscriptions, tombstones, a documented unit history at the base itself. Instead, there's just enough evidence to raise the possibility, and not quite enough to confirm it. So the Rhine doesn't close the case, it complicates it, trading one kind of mystery for another, and leaving historians divided on whether they're looking at the Ninth's next chapter, or simply an echo of a legion that had already, by then, moved on somewhere else entirely. If the Ninth wasn't destroyed in Britain and its trail on the Rhine runs cold, there's a third possibility, one that takes us far from the cold hills of the north into the deserts of the Eastern Empire. In AD 132, a massive Jewish revolt erupted in the Roman province of Judea, led by a charismatic rebel commander named Simon Bar Kokhba. It became one of the costliest wars Rome fought in the 2nd century. To crush it, Emperor Hadrian pulled legions from across the empire, including units stationed in Europe, and threw them into a brutal, grinding campaign that dragged on for years and cost Rome staggering casualties. By some ancient accounts, an entire legion's worth of dead. If the Ninth had already been weakened by earlier losses, some historians reasoned, perhaps this is where it was finally spent for good, absorbed into the chaos of a war so costly that no one thought to record the death of one particular unit among the carnage. It's a theory with real appeal. The timeline fits loosely enough. The scale of Roman losses in Judea is well documented, and there's something fitting, narratively, about a battle-hardened legion meeting its end not in a single dramatic stand, but ground down in one of the ugliest wars Rome ever fought. But appeal isn't evidence, and this is where the theory runs into trouble. Roman legions were prolific record-keepers wherever they served. Tombstones for the dead, altars dedicated by soldiers, tiles stamped with a unit's name pressed into nearly every building they touched. If the Ninth had fought and died in Judea, we would expect to find some trace of them there, the way we found traces in Britain and more ambiguously at Nijmegen. So far, nothing has surfaced, No inscription bearing the ninth's name has ever been recovered from the region, no tombstone, no tile stamp, nothing. For a legion that left its mark seemingly everywhere else it served, that silence is hard to ignore. It doesn't rule the theory out entirely. Absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and archaeology has a way of surprising people. But on the evidence we actually have today, this is the weakest of the three theories, resting more on plausibility than on anything found in the ground. Which leaves us back where we started, only with fewer places left to look. Not massacred in Britain, not confirmed on the Rhine, not found in the East. So what actually happened to them?
Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire mystery. The most likely answer is also the least satisfying one. Not a massacre, not a single battle, a single night, a single villain that history simply forgot to name. The evidence we actually have points somewhere quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. Roman legions weren't immortal institutions. They were administrative units. And when a unit could no longer function as a fighting force, Rome had a well-worn, unremarkable solution. It disbanded the legion and folded whatever soldiers remained into other units still at strength. Picture what that would have looked like for the Ninth. Decades of hard service, stretching back to Caesar's civil wars, the Boudiccan disaster, the night attack near the Fourth, whatever happened after AD 108, a difficult transfer, further losses on a restless frontier, the ordinary attrition of disease and desertion that wore down every Roman legion over time, just some more than others. None of these things individually would end a legion, but stacked one on top of another over years, they could leave a unit too depleted, too under strength to justify keeping it on the books as an independent legion at all. Not a battle lost, but a slow bleeding out. Until one day, a clerk in Rome simply stopped writing the ninth's name into the record because there was no longer a ninth legion left to write about. It's not a story with a villain. There's no last stand to romanticize, no single moment you could point a camera at and say, this is where it happened. And maybe that's exactly why the myth grew up to replace it. A slow administrative fade doesn't make for a gripping campfire story. A doomed legion vanishing into the mist does. Somewhere between Mommsen's 1850s speculation and Sutcliff's novel a century later, the messy, mundane truth was quietly swapped for something more cinematic. And the swap worked so well that most people now know the fiction better than the fact. That's really the deeper story here. Not just what happened to 5,000 Roman soldiers, but how a genuine historical mystery, dropped into a gap the records simply never fill, can calcify into a legend so convincing that even historians spent a century treating it as settled fact. The Ninth Legion didn't need a dramatic ending to become unforgettable. It just needed an ending nobody wrote down, and enough time for us to write one ourselves.